And with me tonight, Anna Soubry, former business minister under David Cameron, now a backbencher campaigning against almost any form of Brexit. Annalise Dodds, who became an MP last year and is now Labour's shadow Treasury Minister. Sarah Churchwell, Professor of American Literature at the University of London. Dominic Lawson, former editor of the Sunday Telegraph and the Spectator, now writing for the Daily Mail and the Sunday Times. And Lionel Shriver, author of several works of fiction, including the award-winning novel We Need to Talk About Kevin. And as always, of course, you can take issue with anything anybody says on social media. Our hashtag, just a reminder, is BBCQT. Our first question from Grant Roberts, please. Grant Roberts.
Should we all be preparing ourselves for yet another election?
Straight to the heart of the political chaos we're in. Should we be preparing ourselves for another election? Anna Soubry.
Good Lord, no. Absolutely not. I genuinely think people are actually fed up with elections. And, of course, we have this thing called the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, and there's a bit of nonsense being talked at the moment that if the government were to lose a vote on these bills that apparently are coming back in the next few weeks, it would somehow be a matter of confidence. Let me be very clear about this. It wouldn't be at all. And if I were to be successful in voting against or in favour of something that I believe very passionately about, and it wasn't in line with the government and we were to win, and there was a vote of confidence called the next day in Theresa May, I would be absolutely right there behind Theresa May as our Prime Minister.
But if she wanted an election or felt she had to have one, she could have one, couldn't she?
No, she couldn't, actually.
She could get one, come on.
No,
Labour going to vote against the general election?
No, the fixed term...
Would Labour vote against the general election?
No, I don't think they would, but that's not the point.
Then you have one.
No, but the point is, Theresa would need to go to Parliament. She'd need to get an overwhelming majority within Parliament. I think it's about 2/3. The point is, she doesn't want an election any more than anybody else does.
She had an election last year, didn't she?
She had an election last year.
Right. She asked for that one.
It didn't go the way that we wanted it to go. But nevertheless,
right.
I think this government's putting forward a programme now, never mind Brexit for one moment, and we need to get on and actually tackle some of these huge, big issues that confront our country, notably, for example, the NHS, making sure that we have a skilled...
No, not answering the question. The question was, should we prepare for an election, not what was Tory policy. Sarah Churchwell.
I certainly hope we don't need to prepare for an election. I think we need to prepare for Brexit. And I think that's what the government needs to be putting its energy into. I think we're 2 years after the referendum decision was made, and there's very little evidence that anything like the preparations that need to be in place are indeed in place. And so I would view an election at this point as it's not a distraction, because of course it matters who's leading the country through this process. But the clock is literally ticking, and I think the country needs leadership that is, at least in the short term, that's going to take it forward. And I just see an election as something that would just create more chaos in an already chaotic situation.
Grant Roberts, what do you think?
My personal thoughts are, very regrettably, I think we're heading more and more in that direction. The process that went in the Scottish Parliament earlier today, I think some of the actions by some of the Remoaners, I think, is also pushing us in that direction. And I think it's been said, we don't want that. I don't think the country wants that. We don't want more uncertainty. We need now more certainty for the capital markets, for the strength of the sterling, for business leaders to make good decisions. So I hope we don't, but I think increasingly it's looking more likely.
I have to agree with you that I think that the divisions, even in the cabinet itself, never mind among Tory MPs, are such that they are courting another election. And that's a Tory party that really doesn't want one. So, it is blindly walking toward the cliff. And I share your anxiety that events could get out of control in relation to Brexit and end up triggering an election that actually nobody wants.
Annalise, do you agree with that?
Lionel is absolutely right on this one, unfortunately. I mean, I've got no appetite to have another general election either. I agree with you. I think people feel like they've had enough votes recently with the European referendum as well, and then general election, of course, as well. But we're in an unprecedented situation. We have now a cabinet which is completely riven. It seems to be incapable of taking decisions. You have Secretary of State who seem to be incapable of being sacked, even although their performance has clearly been below par when they've let Britain down, I would say, in the case of the Foreign Secretary numerous times. And he has to stay there because he's viewed... because he's viewed as being on a particular side of the government's internal machinations over Brexit. And it's not good for our country having this extent of division right at the heart of government. And it could well end up blowing up into eventually a situation where there's a general election. I wouldn't relish it. I know that people in the country wouldn't relish it. Of course, I would like there to be a different hue of government in place. Of course I would.
There's only one party that would relish it, and that's the EU.
Dominic Wilson.
Yes, I mean, total weakness.
As this gentleman said, the main job of the government at the moment is to negotiate and deliver Brexit. It needs a majority in the House of Commons to get its line across, to get its policy through. If people like Anna Soubry vote in such a way that it cannot, then that might well precipitate an election. And that would not be in the interests of the country. And therefore, I think it's very important for the Conservative Party, which is the governing party with aid from the DUP, who, by the way, support her, and carry out the manifesto commitment. And the manifesto commitment was for being outside the customs union, outside the single market. Labour was outside the single market, categorically. The DUP, which was the biggest party from Northern Ireland, outside the customs union, outside the single market. There is a mandate not just from the referendum, but from the last election, and they should get on with it.
But the problem is... Dominic, that all sounds... Doesn't that sound all good? The problem is...
It would be good, yes.
Our cabinet, our government is divided. Our opposition...
What part do you play in
Hang on, just wait one moment. Let me answer the point, because this is important stuff. This is the biggest crisis our country has faced since the Second World War. We have a cabinet that is completely divided, a government that's divided. And to make it worse, we have an opposition that is even more dividvid.
Sorry,
so that is
Anna, with respect, where is the evidence for that? Labour has been consistent from the beginning. We have been. Okay, if anyone in the audience wants to let me know how you think we've been inconsistent, please shout it out, because from the very beginning we said we were going to judge whatever the government came up with against 6 tests, and they were the tests the government itself set out. For example, Theresa May and others said they would have the same exact benefits outside the EU as what we currently have as part of the single market in the EU. So what we're saying is, right, you've got to prove it, because we believe in government being accountable. If you promise something, you've got to deliver it. And that's what Labour said all along.
And are you in favour of staying in the single market
tests.
despite the vote? Are you in favour of being in the single market?
Well, if you're in the single market in the EU, then you are not following the results of the referendum. We've said we need to have as strong a relationship as we can with the single market, because that's what's necessary for jobs and for business. But we don't want to be still in the single market in the EU, because that's not what people voted for.
That's what 90 of your own backbenchers think. And in the House of Lords, we've just seen in the House of Lords, the majority of Labour members of the House of Lords defying their whip and voting in favour of our joining EFTA, in other words, to deliver the single market. You're not daft. You know that Labour is absolutely divided from top to bottom. And this puts us in a unique situation in Britain. And now people have got to do, as members of Parliament, represent their constituents, but put the interests of our country first and foremost.
And that's what Labour is trying to do, exactly. That's what Labour's doing.
Anna Soubry, you complain about your government. I mean, you're a Conservative, sit on the back benches, being divided. What part do you play in that division?
Well,
I don't think you like any of the things that
Well, no, because what I do, and I slightly object to being called, if I may say, sir, a Ramona. What I do is that I listen to British business. And only this week, I have met every single one of the main organisations representing British business across all sectors and all sizes. And you cannot underestimate the very genuine and real concerns that there are about our economic prosperity and peace in Northern Ireland unless we get this Brexit thing right. I have been consistent. I stood last June on a platform in my constituency that I would make the case for the single market, the customs union, and the positive benefits of immigration. And if we do that, we leave the political structure of the EU, we retain
Even if we are paddling ferociously under the water, we need to stay calm and look like we know what we're doing.
Do you not think that there are genuine... In your view, what's going on? I mean, there aren't genuine differences in your view. They think I think it's just playing politics or what?
I think some people are quite sore about losing, and I think a lot of people also see this as an opportunity, possibly, to jump up the hierarchy.
Can I just say something?
No.
Is there a genuine cross-party agreement in the Commons if we had 3 votes, sir? Genuine cross-party agreement.
I'm concerned about this characterization of being sore about losing, the sore losers, the Ramoners. This has become very normalized. And the fact of the matter remains that 50% of the country did not vote for this process. I'm not saying we relitigate it. I don't think we can, and I don't think we should. It's going forward. We need to create the best platform that we can and create the best contracts that we can. But it doesn't help take the country forward to continue to suggest that the people who voted against this, that their perspective and view should not in any way be represented in the negotiations. So, and I don't think that insulting half of the country by calling them Ramoners endlessly and saying they're sore losers gets us anywhere. There are people who are saying that they have very real concerns that are grounded in all kinds of facts and all kinds of evidence. And what we're saying is not we're relitigating this, and some are, but not everybody is, but just saying, well, how do we take this forward in a way that brings the country back together instead of deepening the divisions? And in my view, that kind of language just deepens the division.
I 100% agree. We need to get together, but I do feel that the current rhetoric, though, is damaging the country and our chances for prosperity going forwards. But I do agree with you. We need to band
Dominic
together.
Lawson.
I just want to take Anna up on something, because she just spoke about being in the single market, remaining part of the single market. And I would remind her that during the referendum, she wrote an article, a very clear article for the Daily Telegraph, which said that if you want to access the single market, I think actually she means be a full member of, because of course we can all access it, you must pay into the EU and accept complete free movement of people. Just ask Norway. They pay into the EU and accept double the number of EU migrants per head than us. At the same time, they still have to put up with some tariffs on their goods and have no say on single market rules. That's the worst of both worlds. You're now advocating it.
I can tell you why.
That is exactly what you're advocating.
The government, we have a Brexit government, a government that supports Brexit. Its own impact assessments say that the best deal for our country as we leave the European Union is to retain membership of the single market and customs union. And as Brexit unfurls and we learn more about it, we leave the political structures. This is about our country's economic future. Look, you cannot avoid a hard border unless you stay in some form of customs arrangement and the single market. Only yesterday we saw the cost, £20 billion.
Anna, it's an important subject. You've spoken a lot.
You did ask me a question.
I know, but there are 4 other people on the panel, and we know... Yes, you at the back, and then I'll come to you, Lionel Shriver, if I may. Yes.
We don't want a country made on cheap labour. We want a country built solid to last for the future.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the migrants were brought in as a cheap labour force, and we don't want to live in that kind of society.
So you see Brexit as stopping immigration to this country?
Not stopping, but putting a stop to the higher classes using these people for free labour, cheap pay.
Lionel Shriver.
Well, I agree that unfettered mass immigration has been used to depress wages, especially on the low-skilled level. And one of the reasons I would like to see this country get a hold of its immigration policy is that I would like not no immigration, but smarter immigration. So that...
I just want to go... I'm going to stick with Brexit all the way through tonight for obvious reasons. We talk about it a lot, but I just want to go quickly round. How long is it going to be, do you each think, before we do get some clear idea of the kind of relationship we're going to have with the EU? What's your guess?
I can't see any evidence from this government that we're anywhere near it. I think it's a shambles. I think they have been really appalling, and I think they have really, it's the dereliction of duty. They have let this country down hugely by not giving any kind of clarity about. I see no evidence that they have any idea what they're doing. They just keep telling us to trust them, and that Brexit means Brexit, and all, and that's totally meaningless.
Lionel Shriver.
I'm afraid I agree with Sarah. We
Sorry
don't much
that.
on this. And, you know, I've been especially frustrated in relation to this so-called transition period, which is to prevent what they're calling a cliff edge for businesses. But it's nothing but delay. And all it does is shove the cliff edge 2 years later. It doesn't accomplish anything but give people more time to procrastinate. And I have been really dismayed by how little progress this government has made. And, you know, they're just running out of time.
Yeah. Anna Soubry, are you dismayed by how little progress has been made?
Yeah, I am. I think it is deeply regrettable that the government, after nearly 2 years, has still not decided what it has as a vision of Brexit. But I tell you what, I saw Theresa May today. And I have no doubt.
Face to face, do you mean, or just in the street?
I nearly said she doesn't walk the streets, but some people might. Anyway, let's just move on from that. I saw her today. I have no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that she wants to deliver the very best thing for our country. And I think she increasingly, as she's listened to business, as she's understood the situation, which is a very real situation, real dangers in Ireland for peace and so on, that she's struggling now, frankly, with a group of people, mainly in my party, that want this hard, off-the-cliff, no-deal Brexit. And until Theresa puts them to one side and steps up for the majority, because coming back to that gentleman, and I know you shut me up, Dave, it's really important. If we had a free vote in the House of Commons, the majority of members of Parliament would vote for exactly what I am suggesting. And the cross-party work, sir, does go on. And if only we could have an atmosphere of less abuse and less terror almost being exerted on ordinary members of party, members of parliament and British business, so we got the facts out there and we could then get the sort of deal for everybody, prosperity and peace at its heart.
Annalise Dodds.
I think it's not just about what Parliament wants, though. The whole point is it should be what the public wants. And actually, the problem we've got now is that our negotiating position is being driven actually by a very, very small number of people who are very, I think, ideologically extreme. You know, some of them think there's no place for working rights, there's no place for environmental protections. These are people who are not in the mainstream of British politics, generally, most of them, tiny number of them in the Conservative Party driving what our policy is. And I genuinely don't think that's what people voted for. And I think that's why there's this contestation. But I would just say when it comes to the length of the negotiations, I mean, this started off on the worst possible footing when the British government decided it was going to use EU citizens who are resident here as bargaining chips. If we hadn't said that, if we'd said people who are already here will be able to stay here, and we expect the same for our British citizens who are in the rest of the EU, we would have started from a far better position than when we are now. And just to finish off in response to the gentleman at the back, because I see that he's shaking his head, I think he raised a very important issue. And actually, I didn't agree entirely with what Lionel said, because if you look at the evidence of why we've seen wages going down. There's actually very little evidence that that has been caused by migration, aside from in construction. And can I just say, the real shame of this is we're not talking about getting those working rights improved, like they have in lots of other European countries, by the way, as in other parts of the world, so that people would get paid a decent wage in this country.
We should take the lessons from Grenfell and not bring these people to be abused in our countries.
Well, where they're abused, we need rules against that. And who's talking about that in the current government?
Dominic Lawson, please.
Well, I mean, I just want to get back to the question. And there's a sort of technical answer and a political point. Technical answer is, I think I was at a sort of conclave with various people from the European Commission and British politicians a week ago, and the point was made to me that the EU want it sorted out by June latest, because that's when they have their next elections. It has to be done by then. They want it dealt with
Absolutely
by then,
right.
and not just on June the 1st before then. And therefore, there will be an impulse from both sides as we move towards that point for a deal, because at that point both sides
We want a deal by October.
Yes, but I mean June is and they don't want British people sitting in your old job at MEPs after then. But there is also a second point, which is the problem, which is that the two most powerful people in the government are Theresa May and Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, and they are both people who wanted to remain. They both can't bring themselves to say that Brexit is a good idea. So you have the two most important people in government who don't have any faith in what they're doing, and that is a disaster.
Okay. Yes, I'll take a couple more points. I'll come to you and you, sir, first of all, then I'll go over here, and then we'll go on.
David, you went round the panel just now asking about another general election. No way. Who's going to determine the terms of the EU out of it unless you have another referendum?
People's vote.
So you think there should be a referendum?
There has to be. I can't see any alternative.
If you get the deal.
So
all right. Well, who disagrees with that? Clearly, some of you
I think most
that.
people.
You disagree with it. Let's come to the gentleman here. Hold on a second to get a microphone to you. Yeah.
Absolutely. The country has had its vote. Let's move on. We don't need a second referendum. We've got to trust our governments to get on with it. Stop bickering and get on with it.
I mean, I think this...
Do you want a second referendum?
I think just being sat here listening to the argument and counter-argument, irrespective of how we voted, what I think the electorate are looking for is clear leadership and direction. And the clock is ticking and we are running out of time. And as much as we say that we don't want to head towards that cliff, we are. And please, whatever you take from this debate, please go back and actually give us the leadership and direction we desperately need.
And what direction do you want that leadership to take you in?
The direction... My own personal, I voted to remain, OK? I've reconciled my differences with that. I need now the government in place to put in place what has been agreed by the electorate and make it happen. And I've reconciled my own personal views. And what we're doing here is flip-flapping all the time, blaming each political party and not moving this forward. And we are missing our place at the table in big European debates.
All right. And the woman on the third row there. Thank you.
I think the general problem is that the fact that when they held the referendum, absolutely nobody knew what they were voting for. No facts were right. There was wishy-washy evidence on both sides. I voted to remain, and I'm glad for that. I'm still glad for that, because if I'd voted to leave now, I would think, oh my God, what have I done? This country is in turmoil because nobody knows what the hell they're up to.
It's much more.
But did you know what you were voting for when you voted?
Yeah, well, I voted for like the human rights and things like that,
right.
and the minimum wage. I saw it from that point of view.
There was a lot of applause when you said that nobody knew what they were voting for.
Yeah, there was absolutely no hard facts.
Stick your hands up if you didn't know what you were voting for. No, I thought not.
I bet you didn't know it was going to be so complex.
No, they're starting to now.
I bet you didn't know it was going to be so complex.
OK, I'll take one more point. You in the middle
life.
there, and then we'll go on to another question. You said.
I certainly knew what I was voting for, and that was a country that was in control of itself. I do agree with the lady at the end that we didn't have a clear picture from the government what the ramifications were of the vote. but I certainly voted knowing my own mind.
Right. And do you think we have a country that's in control of itself at the moment?
The divisions,
exactly.
The divisions in all parties are an indication of, well, a reflection of the country as a whole. We are divided.
Would you like to see another vote? Would you like to see a referendum to unite the country?
No.
But if we
have
if
voted.
if you'd known the ramifications, I don't think it would have would it have changed your vote? You see, you can't really win because we did say what we thought the consequences would be, and you chose a different.
Well, here's a good question for you. If you had known that the end result would be that actually the UK ends up staying in the single market and staying in the customs union and accepting free movement of peoples, because no control over borders, and the only thing that really changes is that the UK doesn't get to vote on any of that legislation anymore, would you have voted for that?
You would have
voted to leave.
But that's not leaving.
But not if it...
And that's what we're going towards.
All right, we'll move on. I think we should. We're going to be in Perth next Thursday. Just in case you want to come to Question Time, you'd be very welcome. We're in Perth next Thursday. We're in Reading the Thursday after that. And the details are on the screen. I'll give them, as always, at the end again. But do come and take part in these arguments. I want to take this question from Peter Woodman, please. Peter Woodman.
Do you think bastion of white middle-class southern privilege spreads beyond just Oxford University?
This is based on this report that Oxford University is discriminating against black and Asian people, minority, ethnic, and not taking enough of them. And it was David Lammy who said this, that it spreads beyond Oxford, that is the country as a whole. Dominic Lawson.
Well, I think that I mean, the Oxford question, because Oxford is in a sense national. I mean, it's not just for people in that region. People from all over the country and actually all over the world go to Oxford. I mean, it's a very notable level of foreign students. Cambridge similarly. And I grieve a little bit about the attacks on this because in the last official figures for who were the best universities in the world, Oxford was the best in the world.
And you went to
Oxford? Yes, yes. And so did Annalise, and so did David. And it is... I
don't know what that's got to do with it.
Well, no, since Anna was mentioning, you know, I'm not alone on the panel, is what I'm saying. It is the best in the world, and there are not an enormous number of things at which we are world leaders, and education of this sort, tertiary education at the highest level, we are the world leaders.
But the point of Peter's question is the country as a whole a bastion of white middle-class southern privilege, which is what David Lammy said?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, is the Labour Party a bastion of white middle-class privilege?
Yeah.
Is it? I don't think so. I don't think so. Is the I mean, of course. Look, I mean, the point is, there is an issue of social mobility in this country, but I think it is very dangerous to try to make Oxford or Cambridge the vehicle for changing the social structure of the country.
I think he was using it as an illustration. Annalise Dodds.
I think that in many ways what Oxford University have done is quite brave, because in the past they've been really forced to release this information. They've been forced by David Lammy and others. This time they decided, right, we're going to be completely open about this, and they put the information out there. And rightly, they are being criticised. I think it's absolutely right that they are. And in fact, it's interesting, it was the issue that first got me involved in politics, was this one about people having access to higher education. And I went to Oxford University from Scotland. There's a whole different set of requirements if you came from Scotland. And it's very interesting, actually, that the starkest problem still with Oxford entrance now, I think, as well as the lack of access for black students, is the lack of access for students from the north of England, which is really shockingly poor, I think. So they've got to improve. I think being open like this is going to help, because it's going to show what's wrong and it will put more pressure on to change things. But I don't think we should look at it in isolation. I suppose that is where I would agree with what's already been said. We shouldn't look at it in isolation with access to other forms of education. And actually what's happened recently is very worrying. We've seen numbers of part-time students go down, numbers of mature students go down. So we need to focus much more on who's having access to those opportunities. And let's face it, they're incredible at Oxford. You know, you can read every book that has been published in the English language pretty much in modern times at Oxford. That should be open to anyone who has the capacity to benefit from it. And it's clear that it's not open enough at the moment.
All right. Peter Woodman, when you ask this question, does it go beyond Oxford University, do you mean does it go into the country as a whole?
Yes, I do. I think it's something like 45% of those who go to Oxford came from the southeast. As you pointed out, Annalise, I think it's 2% from the northeast. Is too much power effectively centred in the northeast? I think the word that David Lammy missed out as well is privately educated. And what we all, I think most of us, want to live in a fair, a just society where people who perhaps from less privileged backgrounds have the opportunity to go to universities like Oxford. And what allowance are they making for them? And do they give them a chance? Or is it just those who get the very greatest grades? And the chances are, if you've been to an institution, perhaps a private institution, where £20,000–30,000 has been spent on you, you have a greater chance of going. That's not really the kind of society that I want to live in.
Sarah Churchwell.
Well, I entirely agree. I entirely agree with Peter. The higher, but this is Oxbridge is, and I'm widening it, not just Oxford, Oxbridge more generally, is symbolic, as Dominic was saying, of the ways that we view higher education in this country. But the fact is, as anybody who works in higher education, as I do, will tell you, higher education in this country is blindingly white, and it is blindingly middle class, and we have to do better. Yeah. And so, in my view, Oxford needs to be less defensive about this, and they need to be more proactive. But so do all the elite institutions. This is also true of Durham, it's true of KCL, it's true of UCL, it's true of any number of elite institutions. And so, you know, I think one of the reasons why Oxford gets defensive is because the finger gets pointed at them so often, as if this is not a problem elsewhere. And you're absolutely right, the numbers bear out exactly what you said. There are disproportionate number of privately educated students in universities. And there are things that universities can do to redress that, and they don't do enough of them.
What can they do?
Things like summer schools, for example, that actually can help, that reach out to students in school, in state schools, but also in the underrepresented neighborhoods, and to make them feel that this is a place that they might feel welcome in, that they might feel comfortable in. I literally still speak to students who say to me they don't think university is for the likes of them. And that is a tragedy. That is a national tragedy. We need to figure out ways in which we can make clear to any clever, ambitious, hardworking student that, of course, university is for the likes of them. And it is the responsibility of those of us who work in universities to do better at that.
All right. The woman at the back there, let's hear from you. Yes, I'll come to you, Lan Schrager. Yes.
Like talking about like summer schools across like universities, I was looking into them not long ago, it was like the other day, because I'm still in college. And I looked, as I was interested in going to Cambridge, I looked at their summer schools and it was nearly £3,000 or maybe a bit over. And to me, that's shocking and disgusting.
Absolutely, it should have.
And what are they trying to do to solve the social divide between social groups?
And I was not suggesting summer schools where you have to pay for tuition. That just replicates the problem. I was talking about outreach summer schools, which they can also create.
The man to your left,
that's a good point.
You said, with the yellow thing in the air, whatever that is, waving a flag.
Is this over white panel tonight?
Well, it's all white. I don't know. It's over. How can it be over?
So it's a good question for us to ponder. We've got an all-white panel tonight.
Yeah. So.
You know, and this is the trouble that we get into universities. It's only the people that can go there if they have got a qualification to go there with. And if they haven't got the qualifications, they won't get there.
Lionel Schreiber.
I mean, this speaks to at least both of you. I think it's great for the UK's fine universities to go out and be more proactive, as Sarah was suggesting, do more outreach to state students and maybe lower the cost of summer school. But I would say a word of caution from the American perspective. And that is, the US went through a long period of time of very aggressive affirmative action in education. And I thought that had a number of adverse consequences. There were either express quotas or implicit quotas, you know, statistical numbers of minority students that had to be accepted. And I felt that socially that really backfired. There was a long period in the U.S. when if you were a student who was accepted at a good school and you had a minority background, you weren't quite confident why they'd let you in, which undermines you. And then when you went into professional life, and here you were a black lawyer, and other people thought, well, yeah, you were cut special slack, you got in under special circumstances, and it had a really pernicious effect on race relations in the whole country. And it also wasn't fair to the students who'd worked really, really hard to get the grades and the scores, and then found that they were being trumped, if we can say that. Oh, sorry.
Let's not.
I think,
by people with lesser scores. And I don't believe in righting injustice with more injustice.
No, I don't know. I don't think that. I mean, I don't think it is a first, perhaps, on this programme, but there's clearly a common agreement amongst all of us on this, and I don't think I disagree with anything that's been said. I'll just add two things. First of all, I want a society, a world, where actually we stop seeing people and judging people by the colour of their skin, and we see the person. And we have a long way to go to achieve that. There is still prejudice, there is still race, and we have a long way to go. What we want are good. No, we want great schools for all our youngsters, and we want them to aspire to whatever level is within their ability. But the other thing I'd say, following on from Sarah, I know that all I know is about Nottingham. We have two great universities in Nottingham. Both of them have this outreach work into local schools, not private schools, throughout the whole of the city and beyond. And I certainly know that at Nottingham University has been terribly proud of actually identifying children from disadvantaged families very early on in their education at school and literally coaching them, not for any other reason than they saw huge potential there in adverse circumstances, and taking them all the way through and helping them, frankly, like a good parent should do, which they often didn't have the fortunate position to be in. So there's much more work that Oxford can do, and other universities.
Yeah, I'd like to take up, these questions about race and class, because I think they were mentioned earlier, and I think they're very important. I used to work for many years for one of the boroughs, London Borough of Newham, which is very working class part of East London. And I worked for the education department, I was taught there and so forth. And what was very clear was that the people who were the bottom of the pile were black working class boys and white working class boys. Yeah. And that's so the substance, I think, of the question is Oxford the only bastion of white middle-class privilege? No, it certainly is not. It's right through the whole of society. And until we actually address questions of social equality, we are not going to get the kind of movement that I'm sure all of us would like to see regarding equal access and equal opportunity to the best education in the world. And it's that the best education in the world is what every child and every student and every young person in this country should be getting, but they are not.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the original question, because you were talking about regional disparities, essentially. And the latest figures showed that 28% of boys or girls who applied from the northeast, who applied to get into Oxford, got in, and 24% of people from London who applied got in. In other words, they were more successful per applicant, okay? But only about 700 people applied from the northeast. Yes. And over 9,000 applied from London. Yeah. So you have to say, are the teachers opening the eyes of their pupils to say, yes, you can go to Oxford, yes, you can go to Cambridge, and we should look at that, and not just Oxford and Cambridge.
Yes. All right, and the woman up there, and I'll come to you on this one. Go on. Yes.
surely one of the greatest disincentives to social mobility is the cost of the actual education they're receiving.
No, actually.
All right. Annalise.
Yeah, I would obviously strongly agree with that. And I think we have seen a big change, particularly with those part-time students, as I said before, since we've seen the introduction of very, very expensive tuition fees. But I just wanted to say, related to the point made by the women in the front row,
There are more young people from disadvantaged backgrounds going to university now than ever before.
Right.
That's a serious achievement.
I want to get away from the
That's a fact.
statistics now.
That's a fact.
I want to take a point from you. You can argue statistics forever on these things, and they go around in circles sometimes. A point from you, and then I want to go on to another
Do you think
question.
if we had more grammar schools, that the underprivileged would end up at top-end universities?
What do you think?
Yes.
OK.
No, I went.
No,
But Dean, can I just make one
very briefly.
Every child
to say this? Because I have to take up what Lionel said. Lionel,
Be quick
it's
if
really
you would, because
important.
we're halfway through, more than halfway through the program.
We have quotas. We have middle-class white quotas. So it is not a question of whether to have quotas. It is a question of which quotas. And the idea that people with lower scores don't deserve to get entrance into universities does not acknowledge the degrees in which they're in most cases working from the word disadvantage is the clues in the name. They're working from a disadvantage. And so absolutely we have to work with the schools. We have to give bright students with potential the opportunity to do better and to get those kinds of opportunities.
Thank you. I want to go on. Dan Dobson, let's have your question, because we've only got 20 minutes left, and I'd like to get another couple of questions in if I can. Dan Dobson.
After the disastrous first week of the new rail timetable, is it time to look at nationalising the railways?
You had problems with the railways last week?
No, I'm fortunate enough not to have to rely on them, but those people do. What really gets me is that no matter these companies are awarded public contracts, and no matter how flagrantly they fail to meet the terms of those contracts, there never seems to be any kind of mechanism applied that rescinds the contract or punishes them. Perhaps those mechanisms exist, but the government doesn't want to act on them because it's so determined that the private sector shall and will do a great job, but it isn't.
OK. Let's go swiftly on this one. Dominic Lawson.
Well, I think one of the issues is you always have a problem with the monopoly. OK, there's no competition. And this is always a conspiracy against the public. But I think that is true. If you nationalised it, it would still be a monopoly. And I am old enough to remember what the British Rail was like.
Quite.
And that was also a conspiracy against the public. By the way, I was affected on the first day of that. I was an hour and a half late getting into London. And I don't know if anyone here has this, but you had this awful recording on the trains that said, "New opportunities for travel. Times are changing." And it went on and on and on. And of course, nothing changed. It was just as bad as it was before. And I think that there is also a problem. So how do you create competition? You would need to have competing train services on one line at different times. But I think that would be the only way to do it. But by the way, just to answer your point, there have been contracts withdrawn. There have been people sacked. I'm not saying it's sufficient punishment, but they have the Transport Secretary removed the contract from the companies for underperformance.
All right, your party, Annalise, wants to nationalise the railways or renationalise them. How do you get the kind of efficiency and competition Dominic Lawson's talking about?
Well, actually, we're in a situation where quite a lot of our rail services already are owned publicly, just not by British public ownership. They're owned by companies like Deutsche Bahn. So I think we need to recognise that reality.
But if that's the... if they're owned by the French and the Germans or whatever, they're still not running particularly well.
But well, the point I'm making is that actually in those cases they can be run well, but where's the benefit from that going? It's going back to that company, back in Germany or wherever else, where we could see that investment going back into our rail.
How are you going to make nationalised railways work efficiently?
Well, as I said, we have already got those situations where we've got publicly owned rail that's operating okay in this country. Why should that be to the benefit of companies that are based in other nations? And this is something that the public feels very upset and angry about. It's got overwhelming public support that we should have that reintroduction of public ownership. And quite frankly, the kind of competition that's just been talked about now, I mean, what kind of a topsy-turvy world are we in where we say we need to run more trains, not because they would give us a better service, but because somehow that would just mean that there's competition between different services?
Annalisa, you misunderstand. There wouldn't be more trains, but you would have two companies operating at different times. Because if you don't have competition, which you do in the airline business, if you don't have competition, it will never be satisfactory for the user.
I thought the general view here was it wasn't working very well, but let's go to the woman on the gangway there, please. There, yes.
There just seems to be problem after problem, especially with Southern Rail. Surely the government should at least step in and help, let alone nationalise.
Look, there's a very good reason why the last Labour government actually didn't renationalise the railways. Of course, it would have been the wrong thing to do. One of the reasons that they also didn't do it was because it would cost a fortune. And actually, the current system, because like Dominic, and I think I'm only about 10 days older than Dominic, I too remember the days of the old British rail system, and trust us, it was by nothing like as good as the system that we have now. Now, I'm not saying that all is well. I agree with you. There's a lot more that can be done. But in principle, it's the right thing to do. And frankly, what you've got, this is a really good example of how the Labour Party has been completely hijacked by the hard left, who are bringing back policies back in... Oh, I think it has. And it's going back to the policies which have been showed over decades to have failed.
Why can't they now, in the light of...
Again. Well, one of the things...
Why can't they now succeed having a second
Well, I think one of the things that... I think the cost of actually now renationalising the railways is somewhere in the region of £100 billion, isn't it, Annalise?
That's
What's
only
the
going to
cost?
happen if you decide that you immediately want to suddenly sequester everything, which Labour has never suggested it wants to do. This is a sensible policy which would be done in a sensible way, and that's why many people in the public support it. So effectively, you're accusing the public of being dangerous radicals on this, when most people see this as a sensible way of getting... It could be cost neutral, because when the different operating companies come up, I mean, we already are operating a rail track.
And all the money that's being made now is being... One of the great joys of what's happened is that money that people are spending on their tickets and the money that's going into the companies is being reinvested in a way that...
Enough from the panel. Enough. The man in spectacles, you up there, and then I'll come to you. Yes.
We're talking about nationalising anything. We've got a government that's already struggling to run Brexit, a government that's struggling to run the NHS, and a government that's struggling to run the police service.
All right.
If the problem is the money, then why don't you take the franchise away from the franchisees and make them pay as part of their contract to run the franchise until you find someone else to take it over?
Lionel Schreiber, what's your view?
Well, I agree the government, in relation to railroads, has seemed to do the usual of the government takes all the risk and the companies take all the money. Mm-hmm. You know,
the other problem I would say...
Hold on. I haven't finished going around this side. Yes. Sarah Churchill.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure if Lionel was done. As somebody who spends an enormous amount of time on the UK train system, it seems to me that the problem is is not necessarily going to be solved by nationalisation. I agree with the gentleman who suggested that this government that can't seem to, wind up a clock can be trusted to be able to do this, and that is worrying. But I also think that the problem is fragmentation, and it's not about who owns it. Although I agree about the extraction of profit.
Non-competitive.
Indeed, it is non-competitive
because it's carved up into little regions and little fiefdoms.
Exactly,
and it means that they are all little monopolies.
And when you've got Network Rail owning some parts of it, and Railtrack owning different parts of it, and who owns, I can't even keep track of who owns this, who's in charge of the signals, and why those are always failing, and so and as far as I can tell from some of the reports, in fact, a government report from 2011, that the complexity of what was created by the fragmentation and the breakup of the system is what's made it so expensive, because it has to go through so many processes. So that's why we're 40% more expensive and yet incredibly less efficient. So I'm just not sure that nationalization is the solution to the problem, but there is a very real problem and it does need to be solved.
Thank you. We have 8 minutes or so left, and I want to go to another question, a very important one, if we can do this. Philip Mason, your question, please.
Is the £2,000 per household saving the NHS needs or political suicide for the party that would implement it?
It's an interesting point. The NHS report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies today said that each household need to pay between £1,200 and £2,000 a year to maintain or improve services. And Mr. Mason wonders whether any party would have the stomach to do that. That's in effect what you're saying, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Lionel Schreiber.
I wonder if I wouldn't pay £2,000 for a better NHS. However, my concern is that when we talk about £2,000 per household, we're only going to levy it on half the country, and then more on average, we're talking about £4,000 per household. So that's actually a huge rise in taxes, potentially. And more generally, I mean, it may be true that it's necessary. The cost of healthcare in the West, although in the UK it's not as bad as in my country, it does keep going up. And I think that the NHS is going to be playing catch up for the next several decades. And in some ways, it's a miracle that it works as well as it does. The hospitals now have the same amount of leeway as Heathrow.
What does that mean?
98% capacity at Heathrow.
Okay. Annalise, would it be political suicide? Don't interrupt
we think
her.
that's the right thing to do because it would enable us to, in particular, increase funding for the NHS. The IFS said, looking at our plans at the last general election, if we did that, then we'd be putting 5% addition onto current NHS funding. We think we've got to do that because currently the NHS is just running on the goodwill of staff. Staff who've gone the extra mile too many times.
Yeah. And do you agree with the figures? Do you agree that is what's needed, $2,000 a year per head, per household?
I don't agree. I think our tax system has become too regressive. Actually, if you're at the bottom of the heap now, you pay more in your income in tax than if you're at the very top. And Labour thinks that's got to change, and that's one of the reasons why we think an increase in income tax for the very best off is the right thing to do to pay for this. So not something that everybody would pay. We want our tax system to be more progressive.
Anna Soubry.
I think we have to do this. It's an astonishing report. I've read the executive summary. It's very frank about the challenges. Even though we're spending record levels on our NHS, £149 billion a year, £22 billion on social care, it's not enough. That's the truth of it. It's not enough. And so in order to give the money over, the NHS needs to be fit for purpose for generations to come, then it's going to need some serious investment. So I think we need to raise taxes in order to do that. And I am just being absolutely blunt and honest with you, because we're all living longer.
All right.
And we want a world-class service. But the NHS has still got to reform, it's got to improve, it's got to become more efficient, it's got to do data better. And we've all got to take more responsibility as we all get older. It's not just about the quantity of life, it's the quality of our
You
lives.
said earlier
And
on...
we all have a responsibility.
You said earlier
to take
on
more
that
care
you were
of
talking to the
ourselves.
Prime Minister yesterday. Today, hot press. The Spectator says the government is planning in the summer to announce this spending increase. And interestingly, the figure they quote is the 350 million a week that those who wanted to leave the EU said would be spent on...
Are they not going to get the money that they were promised on Boris's bus?
Are you saying that you think that is likely to happen? Do you think that will happen?
You were tricked.
Hang on a second.
I'm so sorry.
Did the Prime Minister tip you the wink that this was going to happen?
Surprisingly, we
You
didn't
spoke
talk
very
about it.
openly about taxes going up.
We talked about Brexit, and that was all. But I think it'd be a fantastic 70th birthday president if the PM can do this. And it's what our NHS needs. But we have also got to bring together social care funding and NHS funding. It's absolutely critical we do that as part of
I want to
this.
hear the woman in pink, not you, but the person behind you, if I may. Yes, you. Yes, you, quickly.
I think that there should be harsher fines for those that don't attend their appointments.
Do you want to see-
£100 is not enough.
OK. Dominic Lawson.
Good idea, by the way. The question was, is it political suicide? We already saw it in the last election. Because social care and NHS, basically the same thing. We're getting older. So Mrs May devised a way, you can't just tax income, property is taxed in this country too, and she devised a way to try to raise the money that the social care NHS needed through increased taxes, and it cost her almost the election.
No, that was different though, Dominic.
But it's all part of the same cost. It's us getting older and our medical care and our medical attention.
But people...
And do you think it would be political suicide to put taxes up to pay for the NHS?
Not necessarily, but
If
I'm just saying that. And what happened was Jeremy Corbyn called it a dementia tax. It was the first time.
Yeah, but we're going back in history.
No,
We're talking about
but the
ahead
question.
now.
No, but it's relevant because the question was: is it political suicide to say we have a problem of an ageing population and we have to raise the money from somewhere, and it almost cost the Conservatives the election?
Sarah Churchwell, we only have a minute left,
Yeah.
I'm afraid. I'm sorry to those who've got your hands up.
Well, I don't think there's any question that we have to do it. I think the question that, and I'm afraid I do come back to the 350 million on the bus thing, which is that there is a part of me that thinks, OK, well, instead of taxing every household an additional £2,000, maybe we could have saved that 40 billion, found that at the back of the sofa and used that more intelligently. The problem is about the ways that what resources we have are being spent, but the money does have to be raised and the NHS does have to be invested in.
Okay.
I hope it's not political suicide. If we can get cross-party agreement, then it doesn't have to be.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what we need.
I'm sorry, you all had your hands up, and, you know, what can I do? Our time's up, I'm afraid. It doesn't feel like it, does it? But it is. Next Thursday, then, we go on to what we're going to do. We're going to be in Perth. We've got Brian Souter, founder of Stagecoach Bus and Rail, and they'll have that coming up again. And the rapper Darren McGarvey, who you may know better as Loki. And the week after that, we're going to be in Reading. And so the number to call is on the screen. If you want to be in the audience, you can also go to the website, which is probably a better way of doing it. If you want to carry on these discussions, and indeed on the NHS, Adrian Childs is on 5 Live with Question Time Extra Time right now, and you can watch it on the iPlayer or push the red button and see it on television. But as I say, we have to stop. I'm sorry about that. My thanks to our panel here, to all of you who came here to Worthing tonight to take part in this programme. Until next Thursday, from Question Time, good night.